Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm Andy RC and today I'm going to be taking a look at the Turnigy Evolution Pro. Now, I know what you might be thinking, isn't that a 2-year-old product that was replaced by the FlySky Nirvana? Well, I thought that as well, but it turns out that Turnigy is its own separate entity, and it just so happens that the original Evolution, which I have here, was a collaboration between Turnigy and FlySky, and the Nirvana is a collaboration between FlySky and another company. Now, I never got to try the original Evo, but before the release of the Evo Pro, they dropped the price of the original to an unbelievable 26 GBP, which made it pretty irresistible. Now, I'm not sure how long that is going to last, but at the making of this video, if you want to grab a bargain, then I will link to it in the below. But it also means that I can compare the old one to the new one. Now, before I go any further, this controller series is clearly geared towards multi-rotors rather than fixed wing or anything else, because just like the previous iteration, it doesn't have any physical trim tabs. There are trim tabs within the menu of the firmware, but you wouldn't want to have to go in there while you are flying. And while they both have full-size gimbals, which I appreciate, I think the game's console controller type shape was designed to entice or transition, dare I say, the avid gamer into FPV who are used to this type of shape. So when I first started buying stuff from Hobby King, it's fair to say that their customer service had a very shaky start. In fact, they admitted this themselves on a podcast that I did with Let's Drone Out, and I'm happy to see that they have improved their standards. Despite that, I think I've mentioned this before, but the reason I started buying from Hobby King and China in general is that I walked into my local RC hobby shop and asked for an RTF Mode 1 helicopter and was told that they don't exist and you'll have to buy a Spectrum transmitter and learn to fly Mode 2. Well, at that point I'd been flying fixed wing Mode 1 for some 20 years, so I said no thank you, and I went home and found Hobby King, and as you can see, even today with Mode 2 dominating the market, Hobby King have the old Evo in Mode 1 and the new Evo also in Mode 1, of course, as well as Mode 2. And on face value, the Pro version looks exactly the same as the V1, and I think the reason for that is the first version was incredibly popular, so if it's not broke, then don't fix it, and the changes are very subtle. However, despite them looking the same, the moulding is different. For example, the screen position has been lifted to give extra room for pinchers. Now, I'm not a pincher myself, but when I try to pinch with the original, when I get to the extreme edge of the sticks, the screen starts to block my fingers from getting the full throw of the gimbals. And while on the subject of pinching, the Pro version has a lanyard hook. Now, me being a thumber, this isn't needed, but I know that some pinchers hold the sticks in a way that doesn't allow them to support the transmitter with the rest of their fingers, unless you are a hybrid pincher. So it's a small change, but an important one. One thing I think is a shame about this new version is that it doesn't come with a cover to protect the front. You're going to have to buy that separately, whereas with the original it came with that. So you could just throw it in your bag and not have to worry about damaging any of the important parts. And because they have lifted that screen up, the old cover doesn't fit the new one. The reason that they have done this, they say, is because the first version never had the cover as an optional extra spare part. So if it got broken, that was the end of it. The covers for the Pro version are not available at the making of this video, but I'm told they will be very cheap and you can choose different colours, but you will have to buy them separately. On the subject of colours, the Evo Pro comes in both black or white versions. So what else has changed? Well, the first version only had a 5 model memory, and this hobby is addictive, so I'd never survive on that. The Pro version now has 20 models, which is more than enough for your average user. One of the main complaints of the original was that the buzzer wasn't loud enough, and apparently they have made this one louder, but it sounds the same to me. And it's also got haptic feedback, which is a little motor that has a weight on one side and causes the transmitter to vibrate when you change the settings. It also vibrates just once if you set the timers to count down. Personally, I would have liked to have seen it vibrate in conjunction with the beeper when the timer has gone down, but the rest of the timer warning just uses the beeper. We still have these two 3-position switches on the back. However, they've gotten rid of the potentiometer, which makes sense really, as I can't ever remember using one for a mini quad. So in its place we have a power button, and they've also removed the 2-position switch in place of a momentary button. Again, it is geared towards quads for a pre-arm button. Now I can see the removal of this 2-position switch upsetting a lot of people who may have liked it for the original, using it to arm the model. But coming from FR Sky, for me, it's totally out of place to arm the copter, especially in a case of emergency where you might need to disarm quickly. So I think that the pre-arm button and then using a back switch to arm the copter or disarm the copter is in a safer position and will most definitely reduce the motors and ESC burning out while you try and find the old switch, but that is just my opinion. Apparently the gimbals have been made stiffer, but when I compare the V1 to the V2, I can't tell the difference. It could be that you can take the back off and tighten them up a little bit more. I understand that the V1s are already at their tightest when you get them out of the box, but the instructions say with the Pro not to disassemble the product. Either way, they feel pretty nice to me on both models, whereas with the Nirvana, they were definitely too loose with the stock springs. The screen itself, despite being slightly higher up, is very similar to the first version, and its touch screen is very responsive. The screen's resolution may look low, but this has always been done to consume power, although you could argue the fancy LEDs on the sticks could counteract that. You can turn the LEDs off though, or customize them to your liking, just like the first version. They have updated the firmware, but again it's subtle changes, so there's no big learning curves. For example, the TX voltage is now displayed in volts rather than a battery bar. We also have this new fly mode option, which I found a little bit confusing, but essentially it's so that you can use a combination of switches in certain positions if you require more modes out of the switches than the transmitter is capable of. And you can adjust the PWM value of the switch, and it reminds me of what we used to have to do with Pixel, because we had more modes than we had switches on our transmitters. But 7 positions for me, including this momentary switch, is by far enough for a mini quad. One good thing about this option is that you can name the modes, but if you have your goggles on, then you can't see the screen anyways, and if you forget what the double function of the switch combination is, then it could literally land you in some trouble. So personally, I'd switch that function off and use the traditional aux channels if you are using this in conjunction with a mini quad. If we go into the settings menu, they have rejigged the order of some of the tabs. So select model is at the top, although I would have liked to have seen model name underneath that because it's further down the list, and I think it would have been more convenient to have that underneath. There are just a couple of extra options here. The end points seem to be at 102% against the V1's 100%. I'm not sure what that's about. And if you have used any of the mode options on the main screen, then the aux channels menu will tell you that you can't use that aux channel as it's already in use. If I go into the subtrim menu, everything is set to -20, where the V1 is set to 0. Again, I'm not sure what that is about. The brightness and sound menu is the same, except we have an extra option to get a beep when the throttle hits the middle. I'm not sure how useful that would be. Maybe it's good for a beginner if you are trying to find stick center. Then we have the vibration option, which is the haptic feedback, and rather confusingly, the off icon means that it's turned on, with the idea being that pressing the off button turns off haptic feedback. So we can then control the vibration intensity as well as turning it off for just the system settings. So every time that you change an option in the system settings, the haptic feedback goes off as well as the beeper. After that, there is a new range test mode which will reduce the power of the transmitter to test the signal strength. You have to place the model about 30 feet away from the transmitter and then put the transmitter into this range test mode, and if you still have control, then there are no range issues. And further down, we now have a non-hidden stick calibration tab where you can move all of the sticks on the transmitter to the extreme and then place the sticks back in the center. Then to get out of that menu, you press the back button. Now, if you haven't put all the sticks to the center, I mean the throttle is the main one to get right, then you will be stuck in that menu. So maybe that's what the beep is for, but the throttle has to be exactly in the middle, otherwise you won't be able to get out of that menu. And then once everything is in the middle, you can press that back button and it will take us back to the main menu. And that's about it for all of the firmware changes. The unit has a built-in non-replaceable battery, and the manual advises not to take it apart to replace it. The manual also doesn't detail what battery it's using or how long you will get out of a single charge, so I can only speculate that it's using the same 13450 Li-ion batteries in each of the corners of the transmitter, which on the V1 gives enough charge for a day's flying, which of course you can top up with a power bank, as it does have a built-in charge circuit which charges from the USB port on the side. There is a slight difference with this USB port compared to the V1 in that it stops the TX module transmitting when plugged into a computer. So you can use the controller as a joystick for a simulator, which is fantastic for beginners, but at the same time turning off the TX will conserve the battery. The protocol is the same FlySky 2A system, so it will work with all of the 2A receivers, but there is no option for an external module, and there's also no trainer port, so you are stuck with that protocol. And one of the main downsides of the FlySky protocol is the lack of telemetry that it can give to an on-screen display for a quadcopter. Now, it does quite well receiving telemetry to the transmitter itself, but with the lack of a speaker to read out the values, and coupled with the fact that you might be wearing goggles whilst flying your mini quad, that information isn't that useful, which brings me onto the receiver that they have provided in the package. It's the IA6C receiver, which is quite capable and would do nicely in a 5-inch quadcopter. It will do PPM and S-bus with a voltage range of 4 to 6.5 volts. Its range isn't best at 300 meters, but it's good enough for how far I fly. You're given all the connectors that you would need, including an external VBAC wire, so you can connect that to your model's LiPo terminals and it will send the battery voltage of your model back to the transmitter, but it's only rated to 20 volts, so 6S is out of the question if you want to use it. Unfortunately, the wires are not silicon either, so if you need to chop anything up to do some soldering, it could be tricky because non-silicon wires melt very easily. So FlySky's lack of ability to send telemetry to the flight controller is why I think FrSky dominates the quadcopter world, because it can do all kinds of telemetry, such as send the RSSI to an auxiliary channel. But there are a couple of hacks that you can do with this receiver and most FlySky based receivers. So I'll link to the GitHub site that will show you how to output the RSSI to an aux channel, but I'll warn you, it's quite involved and relies you on investing on a programming board. I think there's also a method of doing some miniature soldering if your flight controller has an external RSSI pad, but again, it's a bit of a pain. So you might be wondering, why didn't they include the FLI-14 receiver with this package? Because that one already outputs its RSSI to an aux channel, and I think the answer to that is it's not a Turnigy branded receiver. In fact, all of the ones I have say Happy Model on them. Lastly, you are given a USB cable, which is for charging, and as I mentioned, if you plug it into the computer, then you can use the transmitter as a joystick for a simulator, and you're also given a very extensive manual, which is very helpful. And I think that's your lot. Now, it's raining at the moment, and this video is already too long, but I do have the Tyro 109 to build, and I know every build that I usually do involves an FrSky setup, so I might build the 109 and use this FlySky system and see how I get on. But until then, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.